Morning, everyone.
Good morning,
Good morning,
Rabbi.
Rabbi.
We're learning Mishnah's Erevin, Perek Gimel, Chapter 3, Mishnah Gimel, Mishnah 3. And today's learning is sponsored by Barry Steinberg in memory and for the schus of the soul of Marie Skillman, Moshe Mavarach Isaac, and Neshama Shaban Aliyah.
Amen.
Okay, so we're continuing our discussion about Erev Tchumen, putting down an Erev so that you'll be able to walk further than 2,000 cubits from your home in one direction. And the Mishnah is basically telling us that you don't need to put the food exactly in the place where you intend to designate your new residence. As long as the food is accessible from that designated place during Bein HaShmashas, twilight on Friday evening, the Erev is valid. Okay, that's the principle that this Mishnah is based on. Because I am going ahead and creating my residence, at this spot, because from this spot I want to count 2,000 cubits further, it doesn't mean the Erev has to be put down on that spot. It can put down on an area adjacent to it as long as it's accessible. And it has to be accessible Bein HaShmashas. Bein HaShmashas, which we call twilight, is the time between sunset and when 3 stars come out. That period of time is Safek Yom Safek Laila. It is a doubt. We have a doubt whether that's just that. It's a doubt because we just don't know what kind of status, what kind of point, what kind of status what part of the day does that belong to the previous day or to the next day. And therefore, for all practical purposes, when does Shabbos observance begin? From that point in time. Because we don't know yet if it's once we have a question if it's Shabbos, we have to start keeping Shabbos. So the point is that whatever you're going to, wherever you're putting down your Erev Tchumen, it has to be accessible to you during Bein HaShmashas. And even if it's not exactly on that spot, but it's accessible from that spot, it's going to work. So the Mishnah gives a couple examples of this. Nesanai Be'ilan. You went ahead and you put your Erev on a tree. Now, the case here is that actually you are trying to create your Erev Tchumen in the middle of the street. You're in a Rishus Harabim, and you want to go ahead and you want to be kind of Shvisa, it's called. You want to create your residence at this part of the street, which you can do, right? But you didn't put that. You're not putting your Erev down there in the street. Yeah. You're putting it on a tree that is above the Rishus Harabim. Mm-hmm. Now the question is going to be, can you access the Erev from the tree to the street during Bein HaShmashas, during twilight? So the Nesana Be'ilan, if you put the Erev on a tree, L'mayla me'asara tvachim. Now this tree is higher than 10 tvachim. It's more than 10 tvachim high. And we're talking about that the area of the tree, let's say the branch of the tree you're putting it down on, is 4 tefachim long by 4 tefachim wide. If you have an area that's 4 tefachim long, 4 tefachim wide, 10 tefachim high, what do you have? It's called the Rishus HaYachid. It's called the private domain. Now, you're in the public domain. It's in the private domain. Can you take that off the tree during Bein HaShmashas? No. It'll be a Issa D'Oraisa. You're going to be taking from a Rishus HaYachid into Rishus Harabim. And therefore, Ein Eruvay Erev. Therefore, your Erev doesn't work. Your Erev Tchumen doesn't work. It's not accessible to you Bein HaShmashas. Lamata me'asara tefachim. Now, and by the way, it's not like you have to take it there at that point of time. It just has to be possible for you to take it from where you are creating your residence for Shabbos. Lamata me'asara tefachim. Let's say the branch is less than 10 tefachim high off the ground. Eruvay Erev. Then your Erev is a good Erev. Now, this is an explanation. If you have an area 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim, less than 10 tefachim high, and it's in a Rishus Harabim, let's say, right? And you've got this area, got this place, 4 tefachim wide, 4 tefachim long, less than 10 tefachim high. What status does it have? It's called the Carmelis. It's an area that midrabanan, you cannot transfer from it to Rishus HaYachid and vice versa, or from it to Rishus Harabim, vice versa. Mm-hmm. It does not have the status of a Rishus HaYachid because it doesn't have the dimensions for Rishus HaYachid. Doesn't have the status of Rishus Harabim because it doesn't have the conditions needed to be met for Rishus Harabim, either because of the fact that it's not used by the public or it's not 16 amos wide. So therefore, it's a Carmelis. Now, if it's a carmelist, then midrabanan, you cannot take it. Even so, we still say that the Erev is a good Erev. You can't, how are you going to have access to it? Midrabanan, you can't take it off the tree. It's going from Rishus HaYachid to a carmelist. So it's not accessible midrabanan. How does it work? The answer is it is accessible midrabanan. Because being that making an Erev Tchumen is considered like doing a mitzvah, because as we have mentioned, and we will learn further, the allowance of Erev Tchumen is so that you can do a mitzvah on Shabbos that you wouldn't be able to do because of the 2,000 cubit limit. And therefore, since you're doing it for a mitzvah, so it's like that's considered we're doing this for the purpose of a mitzvah. And for the purpose of a mitzvah, and for the purpose of a mitzvah, the Chachamim said you would be able to take it off the tree to be able to make your Erev Tchumen. They did not put there. They basically suspended that Isser, that rabbinic prohibition, in order to make the Erev Tchumen, since for the purpose of performing a mitzvah. So therefore, it is accessible. If it's accessible, therefore it's a good Erev. If it's still there, as well, it has to be there by Hashmashas.
Well, it's in a public domain.
It's on a tree.
Yeah, but a lot of people are passing by.
But it's on a tree, so hopefully that's not going to happen. But the
it
point is, if it's there,
who cares?
no, Ben Hashmashas can't disappear. It has to
Hashmashas.
be there, Ben
Has to be there,
Hashmashas. But as long as it's there, Ben Hashmashas, and he would have access to it,
Yeah.
then it works.
Yeah.
Now, next case.
So once night is actually there, if it
I don't believe you don't have to need it there anymore.
right.
Now, the Sunday Babar. Let's say the case is a little bit of a different case. Here, the case is that you want to establish your Shabbos residence in a Carmelis. It's not a public domain. It's a street, a street of sorts. Okay, that's where you want to be. That's where you want to make your residence for Shabbos, and next to that area that you want to be kind of shvisa, you want to make a Shabbos residence, is this deep pit. Okay, and that's where you're putting the Erev Tchumen food. The Sunday Babar, you put that food into a pit. Afilo amak meyama, even if it's 100 amas deep, and it is 4 tefachim wide, 4 tefachim long, in area. It's a good Erev. Why? Because again, even though the bar is a Rishus HaYachid, is a private domain, but you're going from private. The question is, would you have access from a private domain to a Carmelis in this case? Well, even though Midrabanan it's Aser, it's the same concept as before. Being that the purpose of Erev Tchumen is to do a mitzvah, in this case, Rabbanan suspended their prohibition of carrying from Rishus HaYachid to a Carmelis. It is accessible to you, and therefore your Erev Tchumen works. Now, next
Even
case.
though you have to go digging.
Even though, you're not digging. It's a pit.
Okay.
Nesanai Bereish Hakana, Bereish Hakundis. The next case is, where you're putting the food on top of a kana, which is a reed, or a kundis, which is a pole. And you want to make your residence for Shabbos next to this pole. Okay. So, the question again is it accessible for you, Ben Hashmashas? Could you take it off this reader pole to be able to have access to it to say that my Erev Tchumen is kosher? So Mishna says like this: Bizman shehu talish v'noetz. The situation where this is really relevant to the reed, where the reed is detached and then stuck again into the ground. Afilu gavaya meya amma can be 100 amas tall, and it could be can be super high for the purposes of being. For whatever purposes we're talking about, Harei ze Erev, this is a kosher Erev. Okay, so now, what is the case here about this kana and this post that we're saying you would have access to it? Now, right, in this case, it's very clear. The Mishna said in the case of the reed, which is something that grows out of the ground, it has to be detached from the ground and put back into the ground. Then we say it's accessible to you, Ben Hashmashas, and your Erev is a good Erev. Were it to have been a reed that was never detached from the ground, still growing from the ground, the Mishna applies, and you put your food on that, ben hashmashis, it wouldn't be accessible. And that's the point here in this case in the Mishnah. That's the issue. The issue is there's some kind of a problem with this reed when it's natural, when it's still growing from the ground, and not a problem when you detach and stick it back in. We don't have and we're trying in this case to avoid any other issues, any other problems. So first of all, as the Bartenura points out, that the top of this, taking off from the top of this, in this case, taking off the food from the top of the reed or the post is 100% permissible. It's called a mukin patur. A mukin patur is that if you have an area that is 4 tvachim long, 4 tvachim wide, but it's 1 second. No, I'm sorry. A mukin patur is where you have an area that measures less than 4 by 4. Okay, even a carmelist has to at least be a 4 by 4. The point is, it's not 10 tefachim high, so therefore it's not a Mishna Sayachid, and it's not a public area either. But let's say you have something that's less than 10 tefachim high, and it's less than 4 by 4 tefachim. That's called a makom patur. That's called a place of exemption, which means that even midrabanan, you can move from it to wherever you want. You can move from it to whatever other area you're talking about. And that's the case here. There's no issue of haitzah, there's no issue of the prohibition of transferring here because it's a makom patur. And from makom patur, you're allowed to move it anywhere. Okay, 1 second. Yes, on Shabbos. That's the point. On Shabbos, you would be able to move it from that makom patur to anywhere. The carrying is permitted from there to anywhere. But here the issue is something else. Here the issue is that when you put something on a reed, something, so to speak, weak, that's growing from the ground, the Chachamim made a gezerah decree, you may not take it off of that on Shabbos. Why? Because since it's weak, we're afraid that as you take it off, it could break. So you would be breaking off something growing from the ground. Yeah. That is the act of kaitzer, of harvesting, of reaping. So therefore, they made a gezerah d'Rabbanan, they made a decree, no taking things off that kind of a branch or that kind of a tree, lest you break it. It would seem that if it's like a full-fledged tree, like we had in the beginning of the Mishnah, at least according to this Mishnah, it wouldn't be such a problem. You wouldn't be so concerned about it. On a big tree like that, it's not such an issue. Again, that's what it seems, because we had a case before about the tree, and we made no mention about. Well, okay, that's not necessarily a proof, but the Bartenura does seem to say that in the case of the tree, we don't have that same concern. Now, if we're talking about a reed, that food is put on top of a reed, and the reed is still growing from the ground, we say you can't take that off from the tree on Shabbos, ben hashmashis. It's not accessible ben hashmashis, then it's not a good eruv. But you may ask, well, why isn't it accessible? Didn't we just say that a gezerah d'Rabbanan, a rabbinic prohibition, by erev tchumen, the chachamim allowed, because it's for the purpose of a mitzvah? Why is this decree of not taking off the reed suspended also? And the answer, says the Bartenura, is because we're talking about a reed. It is very, very likely, or is a very, very good chance that when you take that thing off the reed, that it's going to snap. And therefore, where the prohibition really has a good chance of happening, meaning the prohibition of what we're trying to avoid, which is a Torah prohibition. Because if you break it off and it's growing from the ground, you've done a Torah prohibition. Since the Torah prohibition in this case is quite likely, therefore the Rabbanan did not suspend their prohibition. The eruv is not considered accessible and it wouldn't work. But if the reed already was detached and then stuck back in the ground, if you break it off, is there a problem? No problem breaking it off. It's not attached to the top growing from the ground anymore. Yeah. It's not the malach of kaitzer. You don't have that concern. And therefore, since you don't have the whole concern of a problem if it breaks, therefore, of a Torah prohibition if the reed would break when you take the food off of it, therefore we say that in that case, the eruv is good because it would be accessible to you ben hashmashas during twilight. In that last case of the Mishnah, the Sarei b'migdal, you put the food in a cabinet, right? You're trying to protect it. V'avad ha'mafteach, it was locked and you lost the key. You don't know where the key is. Now, in this case, this box is tied up with rope, right? It's tied up with rope, and there's a lock at the ends of the rope, and you can't get the lock open. Hareza Erev. Tanakama still says it's an Erev. How is it an Erev? It's locked in the box. You don't have access to it. How are you going to get to it?
Mm-hmm.
So the explanation of Tanakama is that the case here is it's locked up with rope, and there is a way for you to open it. How would you open it? Get a knife and cut the rope. Now, if you cut that rope on Shabbos with a knife, will you have transgressed a Torah prohibition or a rabbinic prohibition? A rabbinic prohibition. You know why? Because it's makalkal. Because the act of cutting here ruins the rope.
Yeah.
You don't want the rope. You just try to get the rope off.
Yeah.
So you're ruining so your act of cutting the rope is an act of ruining the rope.
Mm.
And that the malacha is in the rope, in the cutting of the rope. That's where the prohibited act would be, in cutting the rope, but it's makalkal. So according to Torah law, it's not a prohibition. It's only a rabbinic prohibition. It's only a rabbinic prohibition, as we've said. In order to be able to make an Erev Techumen, the Rabbanan suspended their rabbinic prohibitions. And therefore, says the Tanakam, it's accessible. Rabbi Lezer says, you don't know, if you're in doubt whether the key is in its place, ain't an Erev. You cannot consider it an Erev. Why? Because Rabbi Lezer has an extra problem. Rabbi Lezer understands that if you were to go ahead and cut the rope, that would be a rabbinic prohibition.
Mm-hmm.
Rabbi Lezer, though, holds there's another prohibition here. The other prohibition here is a muktzah problem, according to Rabbi Lezer. The muktzah problem, according to Rabbi Lezer, is that we're talking about a food knife here.
Yeah. The
designation of a food knife is, meaning it's what we call in the laws of muktzah term, kalisha malachte leheter. Its designated purpose is for a permitted purpose on Shabbos. But Rabbi Lezer is of the opinion that even such a utensil, you can only carry it on Shabbos for its designated purpose. A food knife can only be moved on Shabbos to cut food. It cannot be moved for any other purpose. You want to use it to pick a lock, you can't do that according to Rabbi Lezer. It's muktzah. So according to Rabbi Lezer, in this case, the knife that you want to use for cutting the rope is a food knife. According to Rabbi Lezer, that food knife is muktzah. That means that in being able to get to the food, meaning to be able to unlock the box, you need to transgress two rabbinic prohibitions. One, muktzah, according to Rabbi Lezer, and the other one, that when you cut the rope, even though it's makalkim, it's ruining, it's still prohibited midrabanan. Where you have two rabbinic prohibitions involved, being able to get to the Tchum Shabbos food, there the Chachamim didn't suspend their prohibition. To go as far as to say they allow two prohibitions, b'makom mitzvah, for the purpose of a mitzvah, which is why you make the Erev Tchumen, that they didn't go so far. So therefore, according to Rabbi Lezer, the food in the box where you don't have the key, it's not accessible to you, ben hashmashes. Therefore, it's not a good Erev. So the Tanakhama says there's no second gzera here. There's no second rabbinic decree. There's no muktzah problem here. It's a klisha malach leheter. The knife, it's a food knife. It's designated for food. Its purpose is for a permissible purpose on Shabbos. Therefore, it's not muktzah at all. So there's only one rabbinic prohibition: cutting, which is in this case ruining while you're cutting. That's rabbinic prohibition. It's only one, and that's suspended in order to be able to make your Erev Techumen work, and that is the halacha. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you,
Thank
Rabbi.
you, Rabbi. Is there having